Welcome. This is the last workshop in the 2023 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candace Black, and I'm your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Welcome to Strategies for Target Language Use at Checkpoint A. Novice language students need rich and contextualized input in the target language to make meaning and establish a foundation for output. In this webinar, we will explore strategies for maintaining the target language environment in the Checkpoint A classroom and for facilitating and encouraging student production in the language. Suggestions for scaffolding language, providing visual and gestural supports, and teaching culture in the target language will be presented. Our workshop presenter today is Dr. Lori Langer de Ramirez. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Lori to begin this webinar.
Thank you so much, Candy. I am thrilled to be here with my Checkpoint A colleagues to talk with you today about target language use in the Checkpoint A classroom. We'll start, as we always do, with a welcome. Here is the title of today's talk, and I look forward to having more conversation towards the end of the session where folks can ask questions and we can have good dialogue around this topic. I wanted to share with you a tentative schedule first of some upcoming webinars. Please save the date in January. A topic is to be determined, but that is coming. Please save that date, January 23rd. On February 27th, we have a deeper dive into interpersonal communication. On March 12th, we will dive into presentational communication. On March 24th, we will talk about heritage language learning. That is part 2. If you have not seen part 1, I highly recommend it. Please visit our website where you can view a recording of part 1 of heritage language learning. And of course, CTLE credits are available. All webinar sessions are recorded, and so you can see them either live as you're doing now or after the fact, or both if you are so inclined. As always, we have our webinar symbol key. Candy was kind enough to mute you all. I appreciate that. I know that if we were to all sit and talk, we have a lot to say about this topic. So please remain muted throughout the session today until the very end. If you see the blue think alone symbol, that is asking you to just think on a topic. And I'm going to encourage you to think about how things connect to your own classroom. So that symbol will inspire you to do that thinking. There are moments where we're asking you to write in the chat box some questions. I do ask that you reserve questions until the end. So I would recommend that as we go through today, if you have any questions, and I know they'll come up, please do jot them down on a piece of paper so you won't forget them. And then at the end, we will do our best to stick around and answer any questions that you might have. And then, of course, we have that wonderful Google folder that Bill is sharing the link to, and there are lots of good handouts there. So you will get that posted periodically throughout the webinar if you missed it already. And with that, let's jump right into today's goals for the session. I can understand the rationale for predominant use of target language in the world language classroom. I can identify strategies for maintaining target language environment in the Checkpoint A classroom. I can identify strategies for facilitating and encouraging student production in the target language. And I can identify strategies for teaching culture in the target language. We are going to go through all of these topics today and more. But I wanted to start with the frame of windows and mirrors. If you're familiar with this wonderful frame, this wonderful image from Emily Stiles, and she was really talking about identity, how it's important to provide our students with windows that look out onto something new, but also mirrors that reflect their own identity so that they can see themselves in the curriculum. So I'm going to borrow this image for a moment for today's session, because I want you all to be thinking throughout the session about seeing yourselves in some of the things I'm going to share. I'm going to share a lot of strategies. I know that many of you, all of you, use some of them. So I'm hoping that you'll have that window to see your own practice celebrated and affirmed. And then the window is there as well. And my hope is that there'll be some new ideas for you today, some things that might excite you that you might want to try. And so it's that balance of windows and mirrors that I'm hoping for today. And I hope that you feel that way at the end of the session. So just take a moment to think on that. Think of some of the ways that you incorporate target language currently in your classes. And I bet you're going to see them come up. And again, be looking out for these new ideas and things that will help you to grow in your practice. We will start with an introduction and a rationale for target language use. We're going to look a little bit at what the profession and research says about target language use, and also talk about the importance of input. So let's start with ACTFL, our national organization. They have a statement on target language use and also lots of good information, good suggestions. Lots of things that I'll share with you today are also suggested by ACTFL. So really good resources there. But let's see what they say specifically about target language use. So ACTFL recommends that learning take place through the target language for 90% or more of classroom time. And that's a lot, right? So think about your own classrooms, where you are in relation to 90%, but don't panic yet if you're not quite there. We're going to talk about ways to move you from wherever you are to just more. Now let's look at our Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages. I'm sharing this document with you. It's a wonderful document. This is our World Language Lesson Observation Guide. It comes from our administrator resource. Highly recommend accessing that, sharing it with your administrators. Let's see what New York State says about target language use. So here we say the teacher conducts the lesson and interacts with students predominantly in language. So that's really what we're going to encourage you to be thinking about, that idea of predominantly. And again, this is from the administrator resource reference guide. Please do access it. There's lots of good information here. But you can see both from ACTFL and from New York State, the encouragement is to use the target language a lot, as much as you can. So what does that mean for us as practicing educators in the classroom? Knowing that we have mixed groups and we have kids who feel comfortable and kids who don't feel comfortable. So I want you to think of what you do now in the language classroom, how you use language, target language, how your students use target language. And all I'm asking is at the end of this session, you think about how to do it a little more. Wherever you are on that continuum, just think about adding some of these strategies and increasing the amount of target language. Or maybe you'll feel inspired and you'll want to do a whole lot more. But that's the frame I want you to keep for today. Think about more, adding more strategies and really enhancing what you're already doing by adding more target language, both for your own use of target language as the teacher in the classroom and on the part of the learners. We're also going to learn a little bit about the high leverage teaching practices. I'm going to focus on the first two for today's session. And the first high leverage teaching practice is facilitating target language comprehensibility. Of course, that's assuming that we're using target language as the main delivery of our content. So facilitating target language comprehensibility means using the target language in your classes and making sure that it's comprehensible for your students. There are lots of ways to do this. I'm going to share some strategies for how to make language comprehensible for your students. But that is high leverage teaching practice number one. Number two is building a classroom discourse community. And this one refers to how you establish a comfortable environment in your classroom, an environment that gets students feeling good about taking risks, helping them to see the benefit of making mistakes, of using the target language. So we're going to talk a little bit about that classroom setting and how important that is to bringing your students to using the target language and feeling comfortable doing so. So we're going to hone in on these first two of the high leverage teaching practices. Another recommendation, if you have not already seen this book or read any of it, I highly recommend it. The high leverage teaching practices are really, really strong practices that are research-based and will help you a great deal in your classes. So we'll focus on numbers 1 and 2 in this session. And then you may recognize this slide, those of you who have been to our other webinars. We talk a lot about input. And indeed, in New York State, interpretive communication is standard number 1. And it is standard number 1 for a reason. Input is where it all begins. It's the starting place for language acquisition. It's the starting place for meaning making. When you shower students with language and they start to use their critical thinking skills to piece together what it is that you're talking about, what the resources are saying, the materials, the authentic resources are conveying. So they're making meaning with this input. Input supports content and culture learning. That's where they get all of the information about content, about culture in the target language. And so that input is vitally important. And then ultimately, it provides a purpose for output using those other modes of communication. So input is where it all begins. And we're going to learn about how to maximize that target language input throughout today's session. I want to caution you, I am going to be sharing tons of strategies, lots and lots of strategies. And you may feel like this at the end of the session, that there's so much there. So I want to encourage you, as I am sharing with you and hopefully exciting you about different ways to increase target language in your classes, that you just choose a few. Pick a few that you can focus on. All the others will still be there. This recording will still be there. The resources will still be there, but you don't need to take all of this in at once. So as you're listening, think about your own context, think about your own classes, and pick a handful that really excite you and make a commitment to implementing them over the course of the next few weeks. So just take a few, focus in, the rest will be there, and you can circle back to them later when you have time. With that, I'm going to dive into strategies for staging the learning environment. We just talked a bit about the high leverage teaching practices. I am going to start with high leverage teaching practice number 2, and that is talking about establishing a classroom discourse community. So right here, you can see my kiddos. They are engaged, they're working. And so I've used them to inspire you to think about your own kids and what your classroom looks like and the way that you establish this community of learners. We're going to talk about lots of different strategies. So let's dive straight in. The first strategy I'd like to share with you is target language signs. So this is an example you see right here of a target language sign. They take on different forms. This one happens to be a flag sign. It doesn't have to be a flag. If you feel that the national connection is not to your liking, you can simply use text on a blank piece of paper. But essentially, it's a sign. I use a 3-hole plastic sleeve protector, very simple, stuck up there with a magnet. And when the students walk in, I flip the sign. So let me show that to you again. Very simple. Walk in, I may say to them, how are you doing? Great, everyone sit down, you ready? And I walk over to the sign and I just flip it. And that signals the change to the target language. Now, it sounds simple, but kids actually obey this sign pretty well. The sign will signal that change in language. Very importantly, it keeps the languages separate, right? It helps the students stay in the target language. Let me flip it back to Spanish. It helps them stay in the target language. It's something to remind them so that they know when that sign is in your target language, they need to remain in the target language. Almost as importantly, it helps me stay in the target language. When I have that sign on Spanish or Español, and I slip into English, as multilingual folks often do, my students will tell me. They'll say, no, en español, right? So it's really helpful to have this sign. It is something very wonderful. I don't know why they obey it, but they do. I also will swap this out. So when I do a unit on Colombia, the sign for Spanish is a Colombian flag. It's a great way to get flags into your classes. So this is one technique, one strategy that could help you keep those languages separate and keep you and the students in the target language. Another strategy is student-created contracts. So this helps promote students' ownership over target language use. This is an example of one that we did with my class. Students thought these ideas up themselves, and so they take greater ownership because these are their own ideas. They themselves decided that this was important for this class. It also provides a set of classroom norms that can be revisited when your students creep out into English, as is often the case. And so I use these student-created contracts, these norms, could be every few weeks, definitely once a term. We revisit them. We decide if they are still things that students believe in, that they want to keep doing, and we may change them if students feel that they need a change. But it's really valuable, again, when students do find the need to speak in English, we bring them out, we talk about them again, and it resets those expectations for them. So really, really helpful to get your kids on that literal same page. I wanted to talk about errors. I started by saying making an environment. We talked about classroom discourse community and setting up an environment where students feel comfortable making errors. And I know I've said this 1,000 times to students in every year's class. I say, we want you to take risks. We want you to make mistakes. That's how you learn. And yet oftentimes, the grading that we do, the way we assess students may belie that belief or that statement. It may not reinforce it. And so we want to make sure that the way we assess students applauds and acknowledges errors as evidence of what they can do. And one way we can do that is by using rubrics. These are examples of single point rubrics on the New York State Ed website. They are tied, of course, to these benchmarks, to the modes of communication, to proficiency levels. And so being able to applaud what they're able to do really reinforces that statement, really kind of puts our money where our mouth is and says, we are not just telling you to take risks, we are giving you credit for the things you can do, not the things that you can't do. And so I encourage you to have a look at rubrics. I love single point rubrics. They're much easier to assess. They give good feedback to students. Please take a look at them on our website and applaud students, not just verbally, but through our assessments. I want to take a minute to call out this artist. His name is James Chapman. He has incredible cartoon images in different languages. And this one is what to say when you make a mistake in other languages. And that's a really, really fun thing to explore. So I recommend James Chapman for you to look through. But we want to celebrate those errors. So another strategy is a class check-in and really connecting with that social emotional learning. Remember, we're setting up this classroom discourse community. We want students to feel comfortable and to feel attended to and to feel like they belong. And so here are some things that I do in the target language to make sure that that is set up every day when they come into class. We often have surveys as a do now at the very beginning of class. Your school may talk about bucket filling. So I ask students, what has filled your bucket today? Or what has emptied your bucket? So it's a way of checking in. It's a way to get them to answer something very quickly in the target language and helping them to feel like they are heard and seen. Emojis work just as well. By the way, these two images that you see here are from an add-on to Google Slides called Pear Deck. Another thing I highly recommend. It's a wonderful way to make your Google Slide presentations interactive. These are images that come from Pear Deck. You just can take out the language and make it your own. You can move the images around if they're not exactly what you're looking for, but they serve really, really well when interacting with students. And so they can get in on a Google slide, they can circle, they can respond, they can click on things and let you know how they're feeling. We also have other ways to check in. They can be these images like, how are you feeling today, with faces or with monsters in this case, or they could be cultural. There are some wonderful authentic resources that connect to different cultures around the world. In this case, this is connected to my axolotl unit. So there's a cultural connection and they have to tell me which axolotl they feel like today. And in this case, they only have to say a number and they can share their feelings via axolotls. And personality tests as well. This is one connected to a unit I'm doing right now with my students on alebrijes. And these are these creative animals that have different parts from different animals. And so they get to take this survey looking at this infographic and sharing out to the class which alebrije they feel like they are. So there are lots of these resources available online. You can make some of these on your own, but that social emotional learning is so important. So check in with students in these ways in the target language. We also love mascots. As you can see, I love having animals. These are some of the mascots that I've used over the years. You can see some are animals, some are cartoon characters. These are great either physical. So if you're lucky enough to have a stuffed animal or to have a doll or to have anything physical, those work really well. Sometimes we use those as a talking stick. So whoever has the animal, the plush or the figurine, they are the person who gets to speak. So that's a wonderful way of bringing culture in. And they can also become another class member. So sometimes when we have these mascots, they become the subject of a story. One year, our students named our stuffed axolotl Alejandro. And so Alejandro was the focus of many of the stories that we told in class. He showed up on assessments as a character. So you can really bring these mascots into your classroom. They can connect to cultural themes and get students talking and serve as really that ability for students to feel connected to this other member of your class. So that's for the classroom. I'm going to shift now to facilitating that target language comprehensibility. Remember, this is high leverage teaching practice number 1. We're going to look at ways to make sure that when you're using this extra target language that we've encouraged you to do, that it's comprehensible and that students can understand it, even if they don't fully understand it. Let's look at what that might look like. So of course, visual supports. And I hope a lot of you are nodding right now and saying, yes, yes, we have a lot of visual supports in our classes. So obviously, illustrations can be an incredible support for students and really extend what you're saying through visuals. Having models, actual physical models. This is an example of a suitcase that is connected to a fantasy trip that students are taking. And so it's really just a file folder with the center tab cut out, but students open it up and there is all the clothing that they packed for this particular trip. So having a model that is physical and that can represent an idea or a concept or a vocabulary term can be really helpful as well. Concrete objects. We still live in an analog world, friends. And so having objects, having physical things that you can bring into the classroom to represent vocabulary is really wonderful as well. This is some of my collection. I'm sure you all have collections that are similar, plush animals or representations of food, musical instruments, transportation. All of these things can be helpful in the classroom. And kids love to donate their old toys too. So I recommend maybe putting the feelers out if you're looking for a particular object. Families love to share the wealth. So building these libraries of concrete objects is helpful as well. Photos abound online. You can find photos about just about anything. And then clip art. So there's lots of material out there. This is a collection of pictographs. So they're really helpful for conveying sometimes verbs, which are a little bit harder to convey visually than a noun, for example. And then we have nonverbal communication, right? And so things like gestures, the gesture for a tent or a thought, right? And you probably all have your own ideas of how to convey particular words or concepts or phrases using gestures. So this is an example of using gestures for vocabulary. You can also use gestures for the facilitation of routines. The gentleman below is doing the ASL sign for me too, or I agree, or yes, let's do some sort of agreement. We actually use this in our school, not just in the language classroom, but across the board for when students feel excited and they want to add their own information to a story, rather than raising their hand and sharing their story, they can participate by saying, me too. And so we use this in the language classroom in Spanish for yo también. And so this helps, the routine helps move the conversations along. The gesture you see on the other side of this gentleman is the gesture I use for circumlocution. And this is a gesture that I use daily when students ask for vocabulary, and I want them to, rather than ask for things or look them up, to talk around the topic and give me an example, give me some other way of expressing themselves. And so these are two gestures that we use to keep routines going, to keep conversations going. Facial expressions are very important so that students are not just hearing words, but they're making meaning based on how your face is conveying that meaning. This is where the critical thinking comes in. They have to match what you're saying with the context of what you're saying to your facial expression. And that's really helpful to underscore what you're hoping to convey. And then, of course, acting out, right? Using objects, you can see this is a colleague of mine who is acting out a song, and he's not just moving quite a lot, but he's got it. Visuals with the poster, he's got manipulatives behind him, he's about to show a video. So you see all of the different ways of using nonverbal communication to help convey meaning. I also want to encourage you to think about leveraging contexts, because your students do come in with quite a bit of background in all sorts of topics. And of course, they know a lot about themselves. So using familiar and comfortable contexts. This slide is an example of the very first task that I had my students do this year. And this was a all about me slide. Of course, I modeled it by sharing some of the things that I love and that are interesting to me. And then students did the same. And so because they know a lot about themselves, because they're comfortable with their own contexts, it makes it easier for them to convey in the target language their ideas. Connecting to prior knowledge. So one of my students last year was a very big fan of the cuy. Not the cuy is a guinea pig, not just because he had one as a pet, but because his family is Peruvian and the cuy is a delicacy in Peru and is quite a tasty dish. And so it was a real area of passion for him. Out of this passion came a unit about the cuy in the Festival del Cuy. And so for my kids in that year, this was a way to connect to prior knowledge. And he had shared all this with his classmates and they talked about it a lot. And so it really fit into that class's knowledge base. And so think about your own classes and what they know about, what they are passionate about, and ways to connect to those contexts. And then ultimately connecting to other subjects in your school. If your kids are learning about axolotls in Spanish, bring that in science, bring that into the Spanish classroom and leverage that knowledge. All of the things that they've learned from their previous classes can be brought to bear in the target language class. Similarly, as you're communicating with students, using concrete connections and examples can help a great deal. So if they may not know the word, by using a word that they do know and attaching it, it might help them to understand. Here are some examples. It's a store like Target. Es una tienda como Target. So the minute they hear tienda, they go, oh, tienda, oh, that must be store. I know Target. So they're making those connections. Here's another example. It's a candy like Skittles. Es un dulce como Skittles, right? And so inserting that brand name, that proper noun can really help them make connections. And here's the one that my kids liked the most. She's a singer like Taylor Swift. That one got a lot of applause in my sixth grade classroom. Oh, we've got some police action outside, forgive the noise. So think about concrete connections, concrete examples, making those connections for students so that they're able to understand what you're saying with something concrete in the background. Another strategy is the use of cognates. right? So students may already know cognates on site or learn them after a single exposure because they look like they're equivalent in other languages that they know. So there's lots of collections of cognates that you could leverage. You could also build a cognate list, maybe have a word wall with all of the cognates that your students can generate, and they likely can generate quite a lot. I would recommend, however, that as you're working on those cognates, to make sure that you write them out and that you give some examples. So here's one reason. Not all students make the connections that you think they should. One might be, for Spanish at least, cine, el cine. El cine, I think immediately of cinema, but not all students might know the word cinema. And so I might write it. That might jostle some memory out of the kids, but then I might say, es un cine como AMC, going back to our previous slide where we talked about examples. So leveraging all of these techniques together sometimes to help really facilitate that comprehensibility for students. And then comprehension checks. We want to make sure that they understand what we're saying. Indeed, this section is all about target language comprehensibility. How do we know that they know? We can't just ask them, do you understand? Because they will say yes. And that's not always the case. So have students hold up signs and images. In this scene, we have a teacher singing out some prompts, and students are holding up flags of different countries in response to her prompts. And so you can see by looking out on the students if they understand. So that's one way of checking for comprehension. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or other gestures that you might use in your classroom. If you have students who are particularly shy or hesitant or may feel uncomfortable, you hold those gestures close to the chest. So instead of making them hold it up so everyone can see, maybe they hold it close to them so that only you can see what students are understanding and what they aren't. Emojis serve a great purpose. So have students hold up a sign. Smiley face means I got it. Sad face, not so much. Again, they can hold those close to the chest if it's something that might make them feel insecure in the class. And then games. This is an example of the fly swatter game, where a teacher in the back of the room is calling out a command, it could be a prompt, it could be the start of a sentence, it could be a word, and they're meant to make connections. And students are swatting, in this case, the character in Mandarin Chinese that is connected to what the teacher is saying. So providing those opportunities for students to share visually what it is that they're understanding can be really valuable for the teacher. Another strategy is question sequencing. So starting with questions that are simpler and really just require perhaps a yes or a no, going all the way to questions that are a bit more complicated. And let's see what that looks like. So first, students might respond to a question with a classmate's name or by pointing to an object. This is actually a task that is connected to a folktale, thus the illustration here. The story is from Colombia, and it's about why the rabbit has long ears. And so to work on some of the vocabulary in this folktale, this folktale from Colombia, the first thing we want to do is help them to understand the main characters. And in this case, it's the rabbit. So I might have a rabbit, a stuffed animal, going back to our idea of having concrete objects, and it might go around the classroom. And so first I'll say, who has the rabbit? Point to the rabbit. Notice students are not saying rabbit at this point. They're just simply saying the name of a classmate, or they're pointing. I might move on then to yes or no questions. Does Zach have the rabbit? Yes or no, right? They look around the classroom, they find their classmate Zach, and they say, sí, oh no, right? So we've moved from pointing and the name of a student to now yes or no. Next, we would move to either or questions. Does Zach have the rabbit or the snake? And now we're getting the students to produce that word. So the answer might be rabbit. And then finally, we would move to WH questions. What does Zach have? He has the rabbit. So really starting them with simpler questions and getting them to just be very, very concrete, moving them to being able to use the vocabulary more functionally, but also kind of building on that repetition of the word. Think about how many times they're going to hear the word rabbit through this questioning technique. They'll be able to really produce it better at the end. So that question sequencing can set them up for more production later on. Okay, we've talked about classroom discourse community, setting up the classroom in a way that makes using target language feel comfortable and fun and enjoyable. We've talked a little bit about making the target language comprehensible so that students understand what's going on for the most part in your classes. And now we want to talk about strategies for supporting student output. So this is now facilitating students producing the language. One strategy that I love is the use of passwords and word walls. Passwords, and this is coming from the wonderful text from Helena Curtin and Carol Ann Dahlberg, Languages and Children Making the Match. They say that passwords are useful phrases taught directly and then posted on the wall with some identifying visual to assist students in recalling the meaning. It gives the students language that they need to deal with recurring situations in the classroom. And so what you're seeing here are my very rudimentary illustrations connected to multiple languages. I've had the great good fortune of friends throughout the years helping translate these for me. And so they are collections that you have in the folder currently, and hopefully your language is represented. But you can see it's got things like, what page are we on? Can I drink some water? I need to go to the bathroom, or I have a question. And so at the beginning of the year, I share these mini posters with students. They're about 50, some odd. And I ask them to choose 12 or 20 or 5. It depends on what classroom I'm in. Because the next thing I'll do is, after they've chosen the ones that they want, I will post them up on the walls. Usually the space right above the boards, the whiteboards or blackboards, if you have in your classes, is a great place for these, because it's a place that nobody's going to bother throughout the whole year, and they can stay there the whole year. And what you end up finding is that students will be in the class and they'll maybe want to go to the bathroom, and you'll watch their eyes go around the room to figure out where that poster is. They'll find it, they'll read it, and they'll stay in the target language and ask you to go to the bathroom. So this can really facilitate those classroom movement, things that happen in the classroom every day. Passwords can be a great support to keep students producing the language and to get their needs met. Another strategy is one of my favorites, is circumlocution. That's teaching kids to circumlocute, which is, of course, talking around a subject. And this is a quote from my dear friend Joanne O'Toole, who says, when we teach students to circumlocute, we give them tools to be able to talk around words they don't know by using words that they do know. And so you saw a few slides back, this gesture. I barely can say the word circumlocution without doing this, to the point where now in class, I don't actually say it, I just do this. This is a bit of a chat mat or a resource for students. This is also in the folder, and I encourage you to translate this into other languages. I, of course, use this with my kiddos in Spanish. And it's just giving them starters. So it's a thing that, it's a person that, it's a place where, it's an object, or it's a, an apparatus that, it's an event that. So basically giving them the starters so that they can talk around that vocabulary word that they don't have. It's also really important to train kids to know that if they don't have that one exact word that they need, their conversation, their utterance doesn't need to stop dead in its tracks, which is oftentimes what happens. So we want to get kids comfortable talking around the thing and kind of explaining it using gestures, using facial expressions, and using circumlocution. It's a skill that is super valuable. And having students with this chat mat in front of them every day in class helps them to do that. I'm also a huge fan of personal vocabulary lists. Students all have different interests. They all have different things that they want to be able to say for whatever reason is personal to them. And so at the beginning of every class, our students, the students in my class, do a do now task where they see an image on the board, they have a prompt and they write something. We use these wonderful tiny little notebooks that they bring to class every day. And they ask for words. And these are words that are very specific to them or to the context they're describing. Very few, it's 2 to 3 words max, but they keep a running list. And sometimes these lists are going to be different depending on what each student wants to say. So they're going to be collecting words that are interesting to students, words that relate to their identity. I have an Icelandic student in my class this year, and he knows how to say, I am from Iceland, I speak Icelandic, because that is important to him. I also have a student who fences. And so for him, it's really important to know how to say, I like fencing. And so these are 2 examples of students who have very specific identities or activities. And so one student might need the word for I fence or I like fencing. The other student sitting next to him might not, and that's okay. And so we want to encourage students to have those personal vocabulary lists. And then this last one, maybe kids just make a list of words that sound cool. I did that as a kid. My favorite word learning Spanish was albóndiga, which is meatball. Who needs the word meatball? Not usually needed, but I really like the sound of it, and I learned it pretty quickly. I love le pamplemousse in French, means grapefruit. And then I think my all-time favorite word is das Stinktier, for those of you German teachers, that is a skunk. Phenomenal. So these are words that get kids giggling, gets them excited, gets them thinking and using the language for fun, and they sometimes will insert that word over and over again, but you want to encourage them to have that playfulness and to keep those lists vibrant and exciting. And so get your kids creating personal vocabulary lists that have meaning for them. Also, equally important are context-specific vocabulary lists. And what do we mean by that? So I love to share with students another kind of chat mat or sheet that they can have out during class. This is called La Página de Oro, the golden page. It's supposed to be yellow, but these have clarification phrases. So it might be things like, could you repeat that? Or did you mean? So things that help them to ask for clarification when they're not 100% sure what is being said. It's also great to teach them conversational rejoinders, because, you know, when you talk to kids, you might say to them, you know, somebody says, ¿Cómo estás? How are you doing? And you say, oh, I don't feel so good today. Sometimes my kids will just stare and say, oh. So you want to give them ways to respond, right? So that's very interesting. Tell me more. Or, oh, what a shame. Or, oh, what's wrong? So these are ways to keep conversations going, and just having a list of those so that students can access them and then later start to internalize them. But giving them these vocab lists will help facilitate their use of the target language. Gameplay. Who doesn't play games nowadays? We love our games, and the kids love the games even more. But if your kids are like my kids, they will go immediately into English and start screaming, yeah, way to go, right? So I created this sheet for them. They have to take it out during gameplay. They must use it during gameplay, or else the game gets turned off, and they quickly realize that this is the way to go. And so it's things that are like when they're excited, yeah, way to go, eso, dale, que bien, right? Or when they're losing, ay, 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 que triste. You can think of these expressions. I brainstormed these expressions with my colleagues, and we had a lot of fun doing it. So try it out with your own languages and make sure that kids use it. But it really does help get them into the language and using it for fun purpose. And then praise. for students during presentations. Students do presentational speaking, oftentimes presentational writing, where they sit together and look at each other's work. And so we want students to be able not just to give constructive criticism, but to also praise. And so this is a great list of ways to celebrate your friend. So after they give a presentation, things like, yeah, that was great, oh, fantastico, or whatever language you want to add there. But you give it to them so that they can look at it and use it and really celebrate each other and learn different ways to do it. And then I think one of my greatest, the thing that makes me most happy so far this year is working with my students about coming into the classroom and leaving the classroom in a way that is respectful and thoughtful. At the end of every class, I tell my students, thank you for a wonderful class. I hope you have a great afternoon. And as you know, most kids will just go and run out the door. And so we've worked on from the beginning of the year until now, rejoinders that make sense, culturally make sense, because in the Spanish speaking world, nobody would just get up and walk out. So kids say to me, igualmente, doctora, or they'll say, you too, you as well, have a great afternoon. There's a whole list of things that they can say, but they have to say one of them. And I am thrilled because my kids really enjoy it. And it also gives them something to say when they're talking to other people instead of just not knowing how to respond in that situation. And then developing functional language, things like chat mats. So again, here's some more emojis. How are you? Lots of ways to respond. Word banks. Oh my goodness, look at this wonderful Richard Scarry image. If you're not familiar with Richard Scarry, he was a wonderful illustrator and there's lots of images to look at. So a great way to build vocabulary is just have all of these words on an image, sort of a picture dictionary. Pictograms. These are the pictograms we saw earlier, and I've just rearranged them in a sort of a grid, and so students can play connections. Any of you all playing connections right now? I love it. This is a great way to do it in the target language. So you can see students can make connections based on maybe foods, maybe things you do in the bathroom. There's lots of different ways they can make those connections. And then sentence starters. So very, very simple sentence starter. This is one I just did with my students for Thanksgiving. I am grateful for, and here's an example of what my students are grateful for. Very, very simple way to get them producing in the language. They have a stem. All they have to do is finish it up. You can see that they've had lots of different things they're grateful for. I was grateful for coffee. That was my example. And please note here that we in school, I have been making a concerted effort to use non-binary language in my classes. I think it's really important to have it there for students. This year, I do not have any students using non-binary language, but I have in the past. And it's really important to acknowledge that and to provide them with this language so that if they need to use it, or if a classmate wants to use it, or a family member wants to use it, they have it. And so that was something that we started also at the beginning of the year, and students are quite acclimated to it. We will finish up today with strategies for culture in the target language. And this is one thing that teachers tend to struggle with. I know I've struggled with as well. And here are some strategies for bringing culture in the target language. So the first thing you should think about is selecting appropriate themes based on proficiency level, developmental level, and knowledge of your school context and students. As I said earlier, I have a unit that I love on the axolotl. I have lots of materials about the axolotl. I love this short story by Julio Cortázar. It is beautiful. It is magic realism. It is thoughtful, and it is not accessible to my kiddos. So it's got to go. And it hurts me because I love it, but I can't use it. It's just not really appropriate for their proficiency level or their developmental level. And so I use these other materials. There are always other materials that you can find. And so just select themes that work for your classes, your proficiency level, and find those materials that connect. You might also consider focusing on one part of a cultural theme. We do a unit on the Day of the Dead. I have a wonderful article about the Day of the Dead that I thought was really good, but it was a little bit above the proficiency level of my students. So following the idea of editing the task, not the text, I had the students read the article. They did not understand all of it. The task I designed was for them to underline words that they felt were negative in red and underline words that they felt were positive in blue. And so all this did was create a bit of a heat map. And the next day in class, we talked about the Day of the Dead and what they thought about this celebration. Did they think it's something scary or negative, or is it something positive? And based on the amount of blue, which indicates positive words, they thought, well, this must be a really lovely celebration. And it's a great way to get into a more complex topic, but starting at the level that they're able to access. So in this case, editing that task, not the text. Also think about building on prior knowledge. Our curriculum, much like I'm sure yours, spirals across different levels. So again, coming back to the Day of the Dead, we start in kindergarten with a family unit. We use a very simple book, a lovely picture book using Day of the Dead skeletons, but it's just about the family. It's family vocabulary. Students take a visit to our ofrenda in one of our buildings, and they do a quick scavenger hunt. So that's kindergarten. It comes back around in grade 4, and here we're going to leverage popular media with Coco. Kids get to see the film and learn a little bit more about the Day of the Dead. And then by grade 6, they're creating ofrendas, which are offerings or tributes to folks who have passed away. And I'll share with you what those look like. These are some ofrendas that my students have created. They create them for somebody famous, as is the case with Pelé, or with Walt Disney, or this is a football player. I believe he's from Denmark, that one of my students thinks is wonderful. And we have pets who have passed away, or we have family members in the case of the one on the bottom right. And so students come in, they're building, they have deep knowledge of these folks because they either think they're wonderful and know a lot about them, or they're their own family members and they can talk about them. So it's a great way to connect to prior knowledge and interest. Whew, that was a lot. Let's kind of recap. We talked about staging the learning environment, building that classroom discourse community. We've talked about facilitating target language comprehensibility. So not just using more target language, but making sure that it's comprehensible for your kids. We've talked about ways to support student output, getting students to use the target language as well. And then, of course, some ideas for culture in the target language. Again, I encourage you to think about things that maybe you already do and say, great, good on you, and celebrate that. Those are the mirrors that we're holding up, and we want you to feel good about the things that you're already doing to help increase target language use in your classes. Now I want you to think about a handful of things that you want to try. And maybe you can give them a try between now and the time we go off to break. See if they work, see what they look like in your contexts. And then there might be a few that you're going to back burner. You're going to leave those for some other time, but do come back to them because there's lots of ideas here that hopefully will help you to extend and expand the use of target language in your Checkpoint A classrooms. So with that said, I will revisit the goals of today's session. I hope that you all agree that you can now understand the rationale for predominant use of target language in the world language classroom, that you can identify some strategies for maintaining target language in your Checkpoint A classroom, that you can identify strategies for facilitating and encouraging student production in the target language in your classes, and that you can identify strategies for teaching culture in the target language. You know what that green bubble means. It means that we're ready for questions. I am excited to talk more about this. Let's do it. I know my amazing colleagues are there manning the chat, and hopefully they have some good questions that we can talk about, or ideas that you'd like to share.